I didn't understand at the time that what I was experiencing wasn't stress or fatigue or some temporary phase of dissatisfaction, but the early stages of something breaking in a way that couldn't be reversed. Because when you're inside a collapse, it never announces itself as collapse. It arrives disguised as routine, as minor discomfort, as things that feel slightly off but still explainable. And back then my life looked stable enough that questioning it felt unnecessary and even irresponsible. I had a steady job, a predictable schedule, a marriage that functioned on the surface, and a professional reputation that had taken years to build quietly without shortcuts or drama. For years inside a mid-sized company where performance mattered but hierarchy ultimately decided who spoke and who was heard, where I wasn't part of senior leadership but I wasn't invisible either, where my work was relied upon even when my name wasn't always attached to it. And above me was my boss, a man who understood power not as something you impose loudly but as something you position carefully, someone who never raised his voice, never rushed decisions, never appeared threatened, because he had mastered the ability to let other people feel included while quietly deciding when they actually weren't. And for a long time I accepted that as leadership because it worked and because it didn't interfere with my ability to do my job, until the project that would later define everything entered my life. A project that began as a vague idea and slowly evolved through months of obsessive refinement into something substantial, something scalable, something capable of changing how decisions were made at the company. And those months weren't just work, they were sacrifice, late nights spent validating edge cases no one asked about, weekends canceled to test assumptions no one else noticed, conversations postponed, plans delayed, personal credibility tied so tightly to the outcome that failure would have felt personal even if it had been honest. And when the project was finally approved for a board-level presentation, I allowed myself to believe that merit would protect it, that preparation would speak for itself, that effort would translate naturally into opportunity. Until 2 days before the meeting when my boss called me into his office with that familiar calm expression and told me he would be presenting instead because the board preferred a senior face, framing the decision as a strategic formality rather than a removal, reassuring me that my contribution would be obvious and that this would still be good for my career. And I remember nodding while something subtle tightened in my chest. Not anger yet, but recognition. The quiet understanding that something important was being taken in a way I couldn't openly refuse without appearing difficult, territorial, or insecure. So I agreed and told myself that results mattered more than credit as long as the project succeeded. And for the next 2 days I convinced myself that this was simply how things worked at that level. That visibility came later, that patience would be rewarded. And on the morning of the presentation I took my seat in the front row not as a participant but as an observer, watching him stand where I had imagined myself standing, watching him begin to move through slides I knew better than my own reflection. And at first everything seemed fine, competent even, until I noticed the small deviations. The way he skipped over certain sections too quickly, the way he summarized ideas that were meant to be explained, the way he answered early questions with confidence instead of clarity. And as the presentation continued, those deviations accumulated into something heavier, because this wasn't just a difference in style, it was a difference in understanding. And as the board began asking more detailed questions, the tone in the room shifted subtly, not aggressively and not openly critical, just quieter, colder, more analytical, the kind of attention that dissects rather than engages. And when one of them asked about a foundational data source that I had personally validated over weeks of testing, he paused just long enough to betray uncertainty before giving an answer that sounded plausible but was fundamentally wrong. And in that pause I felt something settle in me permanently, because I understood that the project wasn't failing because it was weak but because it had been separated from the person who understood it. And the meeting ended early, not dramatically, but conclusively, the way things end when no one wants to continue pretending. And afterward my boss avoided conversation, sending a brief message later that night saying we would regroup, as if regrouping could undo what had already been noticed. And that same night, as if the professional and personal parts of my life had decided to align in their timing, I came home to something else that felt wrong in the same quiet way, my wife arriving later than usual with an energy that didn't match her explanation, a faint unfamiliar scent clinging to her clothes, not perfume but soap, the kind you only notice when you know it doesn't belong in your house. And I didn't confront her because confrontation requires certainty and certainty demands action. And I wasn't ready for what action would mean yet. So instead I did what I had started doing everywhere else in my life without fully realizing it, which was to observe, to listen, to pay attention, and to let patterns form before reacting. As I began paying attention instead of reacting, I realized how much information you miss when you're focused on being a good husband, a reliable employee, a reasonable person, because attention changes everything once you stop using it to confirm what you hope is true and start using it to observe what actually is. And the patterns that emerged didn't arrive all at once but layered themselves slowly, First, through the way my wife started asking questions that didn't require answers, questions about my boss that were framed as concern but carried a familiarity they hadn't earned. Questions about whether he was stressed, whether he worked late often, whether leadership pressure was affecting him, questions that would have sounded normal in isolation but together felt rehearsed. And I noticed how her phone became something she managed instead of something she used, how notifications were checked quickly and dismissed, how it was never left face up anymore, how she angled the screen away from me even when there was nothing I was asking to see. And at the same time at work I began noticing a similar shift in my boss, not in confidence but in proximity, how he suddenly needed updates more often, how meetings that used to include broader teams became smaller, more selective, how information started flowing upward but rarely came back down, which is always a sign that someone is trying to control narrative rather than outcome. And none of this would have mattered on its own if not for the way my professional and personal lives began echoing each other in rhythm, both operating on partial truths, delayed explanations, and the quiet assumption that I wasn't paying attention closely enough to notice. And I think that was the moment when I understood something fundamental, which is that people rarely betray you impulsively. They betray you gradually, first by excluding you from conversations, then by controlling what you see, and finally by convincing themselves that you either won't notice or won't matter if you do. And once I understood that, the emotional shock I might have felt was replaced by something colder and far more useful, which was clarity, because clarity removes the urge to confront, and confrontation is what people expect when they believe they're being dishonest. So instead of asking questions I continued to listen, instead of checking phones I waited, instead of accusing I learned, and what I learned was how pressure was accumulating around my boss. After the failed presentation, how senior leadership had begun asking for written follow-ups instead of verbal assurances, how decisions that once passed automatically through him were now being reviewed twice, and how he compensated for that pressure not by tightening his work but by seeking reassurance elsewhere, reassurance that my wife was increasingly willing to provide, because proximity to authority feels like safety to people who are afraid of instability, and my wife had always been afraid of instability even if she never admitted it out loud, and that fear explained more than anger ever could, because fear is what makes people rationalize choices they would otherwise recognize as betrayal. And while they were both convincing themselves that they were managing a difficult situation responsibly, I began noticing the first real mistake they made, which was comfort, because once people feel comfortable they stop being precise, they stop checking angles, they stop controlling variables, and comfort is dangerous when your position is already unstable. And it showed itself first in small ways, like my boss casually mentioning my wife in conversation when he didn't need to, or my wife referencing things about his day she shouldn't have known, and then in larger ways like a dinner that was explained poorly and remembered inconsistently. And I didn't need confirmation at that point because confirmation would have changed nothing strategically. What mattered was timing, leverage, and restraint, because restraint keeps people predictable, and predictability is what allows systems to expose themselves. And that's when I started thinking less like a wronged husband or overlooked employee and more like someone watching a structure from the outside, identifying which supports were load-bearing and which were cosmetic, understanding that my boss's authority rested not on competence but on perception, and that perception had already been damaged by the presentation. All it needed was to be redirected, not attacked, and my role in that redirection would have to be invisible to be effective, because the moment you appear intentional people become defensive, and defensiveness creates noise, and noise attracts attention in the wrong direction. So instead of escalating I normalized everything. I acted cooperative at work, supportive at home, emotionally present but strategically distant, and while that might sound passive it was the opposite, because passivity is disengagement and what I was doing was active observation, mapping behavior, tracking inconsistencies, understanding how information flowed and where it stopped, and slowly I began to see how isolated my boss actually was becoming without realizing it. How fewer people came to him with ideas, how more people went around him for clarification, how trust doesn't disappear all at once but thins out until it can no longer support weight, and the more isolated he became professionally, the more dependent he became emotionally, which tightened the connection he had with my wife in ways they both mistook for intimacy rather than vulnerability. And that misinterpretation would matter later because vulnerability feels sincere even when it's situational, and that's what made them reckless, because they began to believe they were sharing something meaningful rather than compensating for instability. And I let that belief settle in, because once people believe their actions are justified emotionally, they stop examining them logically, and logic is what keeps secrets intact. At some point observation turns into intention. Not because you suddenly decide to act, but because the picture becomes complete enough that not acting would mean allowing someone else to define the ending for you. And for me that shift didn't arrive with anger or a desire to punish, but with a very clear understanding of how fragile both of their positions actually were. Because my boss's authority depended almost entirely on perception and continuity, and my wife's sense of security depended on proximity to that authority, which meant that if one weakened, the other would follow naturally without force. And once I understood that, urgency disappeared completely, replaced by patience so deliberate it almost felt artificial, because patience at that level isn't passive, it's engineered. It's the decision to slow yourself down while everyone else speeds up. And the first thing I did was resist the temptation to correct anything immediately, because correction draws attention, and attention would have stabilized them instead of destabilizing them. So instead I focused on documentation, context, and timing, quietly preparing the kind of material that never looks aggressive when it surfaces but becomes impossible to ignore once it does. And this is where most people misunderstand how situations like this actually turn, because they imagine a single decisive action, a confrontation, a reveal, a dramatic moment, when in reality it's a sequence of small, reasonable steps that individually appear harmless but collectively change how reality is interpreted by people with power. And the first of those steps was the email, not the one people imagine where accusations are made or lines are drawn, but a simple follow-up to the board thanking them for their time and clarifying several assumptions that hadn't been fully addressed during the presentation. Written in the same neutral professional tone I used for everything else, attaching documentation, data sources, and explanations that didn't criticize my boss directly but implicitly contrasted comprehension with performance. And I copied him not as a challenge but as a courtesy, because courtesy disarms defensiveness and makes reaction look unreasonable. And the response to that email arrived faster than I expected, not emotionally but structurally, because the board replied to me directly with questions that assumed ownership, questions that bypassed hierarchy without announcing that they were doing so, questions that signaled something subtle but important, which was trust shifting away from title and toward substance. And that shift is always quiet. It doesn't arrive with announcements, it arrives with inboxes. And when my boss pulled me aside the next day to remind me to loop him in next time, his voice was calm but his smile was tighter than before, and I agreed without hesitation, because by then agreement cost me nothing, and the following weeks revealed just how quickly authority erodes once it's questioned, because meetings changed shape, invitations changed tone, and decisions that once passed through him automatically now came back with follow-up requests, clarifications, and delays. And none of that looked dramatic from the outside. It looked procedural, but procedure is how institutions express doubt without saying it out loud. And as his professional footing weakened, his emotional dependency increased, which is where the situation crossed from risky to unsustainable, because he began seeking reassurance not from peers or results but from someone who had no reason to protect his position beyond how it made her feel. And my wife mistook that dependency for intimacy, because vulnerability feels meaningful when you don't recognize its source, and I watched that dynamic intensify without intervening, because intervention would have unified them against a perceived threat, and unity would have strengthened them both, whereas silence allowed stress to isolate them individually, and isolation is what makes people careless, and carelessness is what exposes contradictions, and contradictions are what organizations notice even when individuals don't. And around that time the first informal HR conversation happened, framed as a routine check-in, nothing serious, just a temperature read, but temperature reads only happen when something feels off, and from there the momentum became self-sustaining, because once a system begins monitoring someone it doesn't need evidence immediately, it only needs consistency, and consistency is exactly what my boss could no longer maintain, because the version of himself he presented upward required confidence, decisiveness, and control, while the version he lived privately was increasingly anxious, dependent, and reactive. And those two states eventually collide in subtle ways, through missed details, through delayed responses, through a tone that doesn't quite match context. And all of that compounded quietly while I continued doing the opposite, delivering work early, documenting decisions, responding with clarity instead of confidence, and making myself useful in ways that didn't ask for recognition but inevitably attracted it. And when the board invited me to present again, this time alone, it wasn't framed as a correction or a replacement. It was framed as continuity, as a natural next step, which is how real power transitions happen. And I remember standing in that room realizing that nothing I was doing felt like revenge, it felt like alignment, because revenge requires emotional investment in someone else's downfall, and what I felt instead was detachment, the understanding that outcomes were now being determined by structures larger than any individual choice. And when one of the board members remarked that this was what they had expected the first time, the conclusion was already drawn even if the paperwork hadn't caught up yet. And within days my boss was placed on leave, officially temporary but practically terminal, and it was only after that professional collapse became visible that my wife finally broke, because her sense of security had been tied to a version of him that no longer existed, And when she confessed, she framed it the way people always do when they're trying to preserve dignity after it's already gone, talking about stress, about emotional closeness, about lines blurring gradually. And I listened without interruption because by then the outcome was no longer emotional but structural, and I asked a single question: whether she believed any of it would have happened if power hadn't been part of the attraction. If status hadn't felt like safety, and she couldn't answer, not because she didn't know but because some answers dismantle the stories people use to live with themselves. And I understood in that moment that whatever we had before no longer existed in a form that could be rebuilt without becoming something else entirely, and separation was no longer a threat but an inevitability. And the most telling part of all of it was how quiet everything became afterward. No confrontation, no public fallout, no dramatic exits, just positions quietly vacated, relationships quietly dissolved, and a new structure settling into place as if it had always been meant to, which is how you know the system didn't break, it corrected itself. Once the system began correcting itself, everything accelerated without appearing to, because acceleration at that level doesn't look like chaos, it looks like paperwork, like meetings rescheduled, like responsibilities reassigned temporarily and then never quite returned. And my boss's leave was announced internally with careful language that suggested concern rather than consequence. But concern at that altitude is just consequence without drama. And from that moment forward his presence became theoretical rather than real. His name still attached to processes he no longer touched. His authority still referenced but no longer exercised. And that distinction matters because it's the difference between power and memory doesn't protect you when decisions are being made. And at home that same distinction began forming in my marriage, because after the confession there was an attempt to stabilize things emotionally, conversations about counseling, about rebuilding trust, about understanding how it happened rather than why it happened. And I participated in those conversations calmly, not because I believed in the outcome but because clarity requires completeness, and I wanted to be certain that what I was walking away from no longer existed even in theory. And as those conversations unfolded it became clear that my wife was grieving the loss of a future she had already mentally attached herself to, not the damage done to the present we were still technically sharing, and that realization removed any lingering doubt I might have had about whether separation was premature or reactionary, because reaction requires emotion and what I felt was resolution, the quiet understanding that the structure we had been operating within was no longer aligned with reality. And when I filed for divorce I did it efficiently, without accusations, without dramatization, without needing agreement on narratives, because narratives only matter when you're still trying to preserve something, and preservation was no longer possible without distortion. And around the same time my boss's situation moved from ambiguous to final, not through a public firing or a scandal but through resignation, a quiet departure framed as a personal decision, an opportunity elsewhere, a need to reset, language designed to protect dignity even as it confirms outcome. And what struck me most about that moment wasn't satisfaction but predictability, because once the supports were removed there was no alternative ending available. And watching that predictability play out reinforced something I had already begun to understand, which was that revenge isn't effective when it's loud, it's effective when it's indistinguishable from process, because process doesn't provoke sympathy or resistance, it simply continues, and by the time outcomes are visible the system has already moved on. And in the weeks that followed I stepped fully into the role that had been forming around me gradually rather than suddenly, leading the department built on the very project that had almost erased me, not as a reward but as a correction. And correction feels different from victory because it doesn't require celebration, it just requires alignment. And alignment brings a kind of calm that no amount of vindication ever could. And occasionally people would ask questions indirectly about what happened, about how things changed so quickly, about whether there was more to the story, and I would answer honestly but incompletely, because completeness isn't owed to everyone, and the truth doesn't need witnesses to remain true. And as time passed the emotional charge that might have accompanied those events faded, leaving behind something quieter but more durable, which was understanding, the understanding that betrayal rarely feels like betrayal. While it's happening, that power attracts proximity long before it attracts loyalty, that systems don't collapse under attack but under misalignment, and that restraint is often mistaken for weakness by people who rely on reaction to feel in control. And the final clarity came not from looking back at what I had lost but from noticing what I no longer had to manage, no longer had to explain, no longer had to justify, because absence can be a form of freedom when what's absent was never stable. To begin with, and standing where I am now, in a role shaped by substance rather than performance, with a life simplified by the removal of distortions rather than the addition of rewards, I understand that nothing I did required cruelty or exposure or spectacle. It required patience, observation, and the willingness to let gravity operate without interference, because when people build their lives on stolen ground, The ground doesn't need to be pulled out from under them, it only needs to stop being reinforced, and once reinforcement ends, collapse is not an act of revenge, it's a consequence, and consequences don't need intent, they only need time. What people don't talk about after everything is over is the silence that follows, not the peaceful kind but the kind that forces you to sit with what remains once outcomes are no longer in question. Because endings don't arrive with clarity, they arrive with absence, and absence has a way of revealing what was actually holding weight and what was just taking up space. And in the weeks after everything settled, after roles were reassigned, papers were signed, and conversations stopped repeating themselves, I found myself noticing how little effort my life suddenly required to maintain, how decisions that once felt heavy became automatic, how explanations that once drained energy were no longer necessary, and that contrast alone told me more than any emotional resolution ever could, because if something truly belongs in your life, it doesn't require constant reinforcement to exist. And the realization that my marriage had required reinforcement long before it required affection reframed everything in hindsight, because betrayal wasn't the cause of the collapse, it was the symptom of a structure that had already been misaligned, and the same was true professionally, because my boss's authority hadn't been taken from him, it had been withdrawn by a system that no longer found it useful, and understanding that distinction removed the final traces of resentment I might have held, because resentment assumes injustice, and what happened wasn't unjust, it was simply inevitable once enough inconsistencies accumulated, and occasionally I would hear fragments of what happened afterward, not directly but through the way people spoke, about my former boss trying to reframe his departure, about my ex-wife struggling to adjust to a version of stability that didn't involve proximity to power, and those fragments didn't trigger satisfaction or anger, they triggered detachment, because detachment is what happens when outcomes are no longer emotionally negotiable, and the final clarity came from recognizing that at no point did I actually win something from their loss. What I gained came from removing myself from positions that required compromise to sustain, and that removal created space for alignment rather than reward, and alignment is quieter than victory but far more durable, because it doesn't depend on comparison, and as I moved forward in a life that no longer required me to perform stability for others, I understood that the most effective form of revenge was never destruction, exposure, or humiliation. It was refusing to carry the weight of someone else's dishonesty, because once you stop carrying it, it falls where it belongs, and when it does, the fall doesn't need witnesses, it only needs time, and time, given enough of it, always chooses the side of what is real.